Thank you, Dan. Thank you so much for that kind introduction and for like gloves off, allowing me to just crash and invite myself to come give a talk here today. So I've been super curious about UC Merced for a while, not only because not only is Dan here, and I've known Dan for a while, but Sorkim is a good friend of mine and moved here and has been telling me a lot of interesting things about like cultural differences between here and Kentucky, and also just the idea of a young university is cool and exciting, and the idea of a young land-grant university is especially cool and exciting, and it's even more exciting than I knew because you all have this new experiment station that's really getting underway right now. And so I'll say a little bit more about that later in the talk, but I want to begin with an acknowledgement of some land. So I want to pause. We pause to acknowledge all local indigenous peoples, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who inhabited this land. We embrace their continued connection to this region and thank them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and collaborate on their traditional homeland. Let us now take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Yokuts and Miwok people, past and present. So the land that we are on belongs to Yokuts and Miwok. Other lands in California were sold by some colonizers to other colonizers to make money to establish the land-grant system of universities in the UC system and in all land-grant universities across the United States. This happened first in 1862 through an act called the Morrill Act. This is where the UC University Farm and all of the land-grant university systems were encoded into the laws of the United States. It begins being enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America, and Congress assembled that there be granted to the several states for purposes hereinafter mentioned an amount of public land, so on and so forth. Public land, of course, is taken land. And while I was not able to locate the names of all of the tribes of all of the lands that were sold and taken to be resold in order to identify and then profit from the taking of land from peoples who have traditionally inhabited these lands, I did find just kind of an embarrassingly large number of tribes and nations, which will surprise no one, and is true all across our country, and is an inherent part of the story of doing public education, public higher education in the United States, because the land grant system of universities, of which UC Merced is part, of which the University of Kentucky is part, of which I've spent most of my career at one way or another, was all started by this Land Grant Act. It continues because not only did they take land to do it, but they also changed the way we thought of what universities should be. Be it further enacted that all monies derived from the sale of the land shall be inviolably appropriated by each state, which may take and claim the benefit of this act to the endowment, support, and maintenance of at least one college, where the leading object shall be, without excluding scientific and classical studies, and including military tactics, to teach such branches of learning as are related to agriculture and the mechanic arts, to promote the liberal and practical education of the industrial classes. This is a really new idea in the philosophy of education in the 1860s, and it got into the national laws of the land of the United States. The idea that we need to promote learning related to agriculture and mechanic arts came around as a result of social conditions that were happening in the United States in the 1860s. You can all guess what those were. If you don't want to guess, because it's Friday afternoon and it's been a long week, it was the American Civil War. and the emancipation of formerly enslaved peoples who were providing free labor to generate agricultural and mechanical products. So emancipation comes around, and the politicians who are running our country realize that they need to do something to improve our ability to feed the people of the United States. And they decide college is the answer. And a new kind of college is the answer, because prior to this, college was mostly for scientific and classical studies. And it generated three distinct professions: lawyers, doctors, and preachers. And those professions were tied to the particular studies that were happening in some of the private colleges, primarily on the East Coast of the United States. The idea that we needed college for the industrial classes, whatever those are, was new and was encoded into our laws as we took lands from Native peoples. 1862 was not the only time that we codified education in this way. There were further acts that generated the founding of additional universities in 1890 and 1994. The 1890 schools were started during the segregation era of Reconstruction in the US South, where I live in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. We have Kentucky State University up in Frankfort, in our capital, was started in the 1890 Land Grant Act, where we did another round of land grants, used the profits to start primarily Black serving institutions. And you can see by the stars, those are in areas of the country that were segregated in 1890 by law, and many of which remain segregated in 2023 by tacit practices. In 1994, and that is not a mistake, it is 1994, not 1894, another round of land grants were enacted to generate primarily Indigenous serving institutions, because somewhere in the 1990s, they decided maybe we should acknowledge that some of the lands that established public education, public higher education in the United States came from peoples, and we would like to try to create ways to incorporate them back into the laws of the United States. Okay. That's most of the end of the history lesson. And I wanted to start here, not only because it's important to know where you are and where you come from, but because the idea of the thing we're going to be talking about today, agricultural science, is born with the founding of the land-grant universities. Agricultural science, unlike many of the sciences that philosophers of science, like Dan, like myself, like some of the other folks in this room, study, was an institutionally defined science. It's not that there weren't people who were experimenting with farms and fields for centuries and millennia. That's how we got agriculture in the first place, and that's how we got a lot of civilization in the way that we think of it in these days. But agricultural science as a specific scientific enterprise really takes off in the 1860s to 1880s through a series of legal enterprises in the United States that define how one should and one can do science with agriculture. There's one big goal, and it's increase efficiency, increase yield. This is the Industrial Revolution era. This is factory time. This is when we are looking to science to solve extra scientific problems. For those of you who aren't philosophers of science, extra scientific doesn't mean super duper scientific. It means non-scientific, outside, extraneous, external to science. We're looking to science to solve extra scientific problems, namely feeding a hungry nation. So in the late 19th century, we see this relationship between produce, producers, and production that takes off in a new way with the founding of the Morrill Act, which integrates education, industrialization, and civic and political responses to labor changes resulting from abolition. Just to remind you what we've already talked about. They're trying to solve a big problem, which is efficient food production, also known as how to increase yield. Yield is an incredibly important concept in agricultural economics and economics in general. It's one that we're not going to unpack today, but I want to highlight it in part because it's like my next research agenda item. I want to think about what yield is, and there are a lot of unusual ways that people think about yield within agriculture. So I'm happy to talk about that more, and I may accidentally talk about it more because I get excited. This is our problem. This is the solution. So this is Clyde Crenshaw Plainwell of Alpena County, Michigan, and a child standing by two maize sow piles. Maize is how agriculture people say corn. On the left, we see an unfertilized sow pile here. The corn stalk ends somewhere around here. On the right, we see a fertilized sow pile that has been fertilized with 200 pounds of a good mixed fertilizer per acre. We don't know what the fertilizer was. This is a picture that comes from the Michigan State University archives. We do also have data from there, according to the archival notes, that this acre yielded 40 baskets, and this acre yielded 100 baskets. So I want you to notice a couple things about this picture. We see the difference in yield. We also see people interacting with plants. What we don't see is a ton of like wild plant life. This is agriculture at work. And we all know, because you drive around this valley all the time, that this is what people make land look like when we want to produce food. There's also a really interesting relationship between the two figures in this photo. We don't actually know that this is that guy's kid, but probably most of us think that it's that guy's kid or some kid that's importantly related to him, could be a grandson. There's a whole other side of the agriculture story that looks at the role of family and relationships, and I would be delighted to tell you what to read if you're interested in that side of it. There's a scholar named Gabe Rosenberg who works on this a lot. I want to work not on what's going on with the family, but what's going on with the political and institutional structures and the scientific structures, what we call in philosophy the epistemic structures that support getting the difference between our A/B test in this cornfield. So we see in the development of agricultural science in the second half of the 19th century and into the 20th century, an emphasis on what I'm going to call Baconian record keeping. This is Bacon of the scientific method Bacon, not Bacon of the hog farm Bacon. Baconian record keeping, A/B testing, because we don't necessarily know it from this photo, but the way that a lot of the A/B testing, fertilized and unfertilized soil tests, were happening in the late 19th century and into the 20th century was folks from land-grant universities going out to farming communities, making friends with the farmers and their kids, and handing the kids a bag of corn and saying, go plant this bag of corn on an acre. Let me know how much corn you can get. Keep records of what you do, and whoever makes the most corn wins money. This is what's called a corn club. Do we have anyone who did 4-H or FFA? Ronnie, I knew I liked you. So 4-H or FFA? Okay. Okay. So did you ever do a project book in 4-H?
No.
Interesting. What did you do in FFA?
I did competition. I did agronomy, wildlife, and agri shoots.
Okay, so in the agronomy competitions, are you going to fairs?
Yes.
Okay. What were you doing before you went to fairs?
What do you like in preparation?
Yeah.
Mostly seed and plant ID.
Okay.
And then a little bit of general practical knowledge for how farming works.
Okay, cool.
Fertilizer.
Yeah. So for those of us in the room who aren't Ronnie, I'm going to open the conversation back up. Anyone seen Napoleon Dynamite? Back in the day, yeah, everyone above a certain age. We're talking Napoleon Dynamite stuff, milk testing at the fair. 4-H, which I did not do FFA. FFA was like the real farm kids. 4-H was the farm kids who, had to go to other after school activities. FFA was hardcore, so respect to Ronnie. 4-H centered around completing project books. And like, I'm a philosophy professor. Of course, as a child, I loved recreational homework. Project books asked you to keep records of what you were doing to complete a project over the year. And if you did well enough on the project, someone would look at your workbook and say, you can go to the county fair. And then you would compete against other kids who were doing a similar project. And the project, for me, sometimes it was showing horses. It was also sometimes writing. One time I built a piece of woodwork. And the projects were not just go make a thing. It was go make a thing and keep records of it. This comes out of Iowa County Corn Clubs that were trying to get kids to think about their projects on the farm differently, and to think about their projects on the farm not just as things that they do, but as things that they can record and tell other people about. And so kids, probably not much older than this kid in the picture, were given bushels of corn, and then they, of corn seed, and then they were asked to produce a yield, and whoever won the biggest yield won a contest. And then they went home and told their parents that they won a contest. And then their parents said, what contest did you win? And then the kids explained that they recorded what they did to create a really productive acre of corn. And then maybe they showed their parents what things they did to boost the yield of that acre of corn. And then maybe their parents tried it too. And this is how, for a community that can be quite closed and can be quite resistant to, say, large-scale top-down government intervention, farmers started to learn to produce agriculture scientifically. And then some of those kids grew up, and then the 4-H activities that they were doing and the corn clubs that they were doing that were run by kind folks who were extension workers at universities wanted to go learn more. And they came to the universities and they studied agronomy. And then FFA was founded, and I don't know the story of FFA. So we'll figure that out another day. I'm already threatening to come back because not only was this happening in the founding of the universities that you work at, the university that I work at, but there was further legislature that said, okay, we figured out how to make universities for the purposes of improving agricultural and mechanical arts. Now we need more land. And now this time we're not going to sell the land. We're going to keep the land and we're going to do experiments on it. The Hatch Act, the 1888 Hatch Act, establishes the Agricultural Experiment Station Network, which is expanded all over the United States, expanded into the ocean, into water systems, into air systems, into a variety of ways of thinking about doing experiment associated with land-grant universities. And last year, you all got one. How many of you know this? Yeah, we're super excited, right? It's really cool. I got to tour a little bit of the land that is getting turned into the UC Merced Agricultural Experiment Station yesterday. And there's some really innovative things that are happening with this experiment station. The data that I've collected in the rest of this talk, which will be, I promise, about potatoes very soon, comes from work that I did at Michigan State University, which was one of the first land-grant universities, one of the first to establish Hatch Act experiment stations. They have had experiment stations since 1888. University of Kentucky has buildings associated with the 1888 Hatch Act, and they have had experiment stations since just about 1888. Merced has an experiment station that has existed since 2022, and I cannot wait to see what happens in like 5 or 10 years, what's going on. This picture in the background is a little hard to see on this projector, but this is actually your experiment station. I took this picture yesterday. So this is the border. These are the almond farms that you can kind of see over here. These flags are lined for where a hedgerow is going to go for when the almond farms become houses in 30 years. The guy who is setting this up has a really long and interesting history in a variety of types of farming projects, and he is laying the ground for an experimental infrastructure that is going to be one of a kind. We don't have other experimental infrastructure like this that will be available for public use in the San Joaquin Valley. We certainly don't have a ton of structures like this that have been put in to experimental use to university use in the past half century. So very cool stuff happening at Merced. Agricultural science uses these experiment stations and uses all of the infrastructure of like regular science to, which includes like integrating biology, ecology, chemistry, mechanical engineering, fluid physics, soil physics, is a lot of fluid dynamics and a lot of chemistry and microbiology all together, and economics, really importantly, and economics to improve yield. And again, because I can't stop previewing myself, like to improve yield means to figure out what yield is and whether yield is actually just the number of baskets you get off an acre or the quality of usable fruit that you can pick off a tree or how good a cookie tastes when you make it with a particular kind of wheat. Those are yield questions that hopefully I'll be able to be back here in a year and tell you more about. Thing to note about agricultural science, it is super application driven. The research programs are really industrially and corporately funded. They're really not shy about that. Sometimes people are shy about mentioning that in like medical sciences. It's just a fact of life in ag science. Like, hey, I work for the Michigan Potato Council. I take money from this farmer and ORIDA and all of these other folks. And that's just how research gets done in a very matter of fact of life way. So you see industrial funding, you see relationships with farms and agribusiness that look unusual for those of us who study science when we start with a picture of science that comes from physics and chemistry and biology textbooks. Because when was the last time you picked up a chemistry textbook and saw the word Merck in it? Maybe on the copyright page. We also see integration of commercial product testing into university-sponsored research and just less shyness about that. So I'm going to give you, for the rest of the talk, a bunch of examples. We'll see how many we get through. This is 4 hours, 5 hours, is that right? But seriously, when do you want me to shut up? Perfect. So I'm going to give you like 2 or 3 examples. Before we do that, I want to play the game that has the title of the talk in it. What kind of thing is a potato? What kinds of things does agricultural science study? This is the cover image of the talk. And I'm going to ask you all to do a little bit of visual literacy. This is a different kind of humanities work. What do you see in this picture? Potatoes. What else? Tractor, basket, soil, people, yeah, people. You know, I got that question on Wednesday too. I'm not sure. I think it's a potato sack, but I could be wrong. It could be harvesting green waste, like tops of the plants. Yeah, lots of things going into the harvesting of potatoes. People, machinery, equipment like the basket. We see, I love when everyone remembers that there's soil and potatoes are in the soil, from the soil, of the soil, under the soil until you harvest them. So when we consider potatoes as an agricultural object or possibly agricultural process, we think about a whole host of things. Plant variety genetics and phenotypes, and very particular connections between genetics and phenotypes. I'll say more about that in a second. We think about the plant life cycle, which includes the tuber, the potato that you eat that's on your table, the seed, which is a smaller potato that gets cut up and replanted. We think about plant production, so putting the seed in the ground, making it grow, getting it to flower, harvesting. And then there's also this whole other side of potato research, especially that is centered on potato storage. I think I'm going to skip that for time today, but I'm really excited about it. So if you want to talk to me about it in Q&A, we can. We think about the plant environment, things like soil health, drainage, fertilization, weeds, pests, all of these impacts on production, on yield, disease and pathogen host conditions, storage, like I said, economics, and diseases that occur during storage as opposed to when the potato is in the ground. We also think a lot about human nutrition. The Potato Council, the potato lobbies that go to Washington are really concerned that you think a potato is a vegetable. Maybe not that you think a potato is a vegetable, but the people who are in charge of free lunch, school lunch programs think potatoes are vegetables. Because if they're vegetables, then they get to be part of free lunches and school lunches in a way that allows potato farmers and not, say, asparagus farmers to get some national contracts. We also think about social, economic, and health impacts, climate impacts. I think this is also an example that I'm not going to get into detail on, but Frito-Lay, the guys with the chips, have made a sustainability pledge recently that if you go to their website, it says nothing but 100% sustainably sourced corn and potatoes. Well, we all know what greenwashing is because we all live in California. Obviously, there's some greenwashing there, but there are some very specific regulations that have been set out for potato producers to hit certain targets for carbon caps and how to create potatoes that will meet the other standards for chipping potatoes, which are the potatoes that turn into chips. Chip stock potatoes have different sugar and starch balances than the potatoes you buy in grocery stores, which is why if you've ever tried to make chips out of a grocery store potato, it might taste a little funny. They actually engineer potatoes for chips. And chip stock potatoes require slightly different harvest, slightly different water and fertilization needs. And so getting all of that within whatever Frito-Lay wants it to be is a agricultural science problem these days. Okay, so example one, variety trials and breeding commercialization. This is a slide that I was given by an MSU extension specialist to give a model of all of the stages that go into commercializing a new variety of potato. There are new varieties of potatoes that are in your grocery store all of the time. You don't think about it because they're all labeled russet or Yukon Gold or Redskin. One of the only fruit and vegetable products, horticultural products that we see that actually labels itself by varietal is apples. You all know probably at least 5 varietals of apples because you've bought 5 varietals of apples. Do you know that there is one called Ludacrisp? It has just hit grocery stores in the last 3 weeks. We heard about it in Michigan this spring, and like my research team and I have just been like stalking co-op websites to find out when we can try the Ludacrisp apples. So I've actually got some as my celebration of making it back to Kentucky. They're the new ones after Cosmic Crisp, but of course everyone's going to want the Ludacrisp apples. So potato varietals aren't displayed in the grocery stores. Sometimes if you get a CSA box, they will tell you what actual varietals you have. People are making new ones all the time. And they're making a lot that will never see the light of day, not even with your experimental hippy dippy CSA farmer who's trying stuff in their backyard. They're being made and tested at primarily extension-driven research sites across the country. And Michigan, in fact, has one of the bigger potato breeding programs. Michigan does a lot with potatoes, even though no one thinks about Michigan for potatoes. What do we think about for potatoes? Idaho, right? And occasionally we remember that Canada exists and there's a thing called Yukon Golds, right? And that Yukon is part of Canada. We think about Idaho for producing potatoes, and it is the #1 producer of potatoes. Michigan is the #1 storer of potatoes. And there is one reason for that, and that reason is water. Michigan is surrounded by lakes, which puts more water in the air, which makes the potatoes that are stored in Michigan stay heavier, which means you get more money and increase your yield when you sell them to Frito-Lay. So Michigan does a lot with potato research because of all of the money that they make storing potatoes. There's only 62 potato farmers in Michigan, and there's that's a low number in case you're wondering. There's a lot more than that in Idaho, but there's a lot of council interest and collected interest in potatoes across the state of Michigan. There are also people in Michigan who study wild potatoes. And this is a different way of thinking about what potatoes are. So in this example, we learned about wild potato genetic diversity. So the paper here, Genome Evolution and Diversity of Wild and Cultivated Potatoes, went and mapped potatoes from all across the New World, primarily wild type clades from the west coast of South America, and looked at a few other landrace potatoes and other varietals of potatoes that are growing native to the area. But the reason they did that, according to the abstract, is because looking at wild potatoes, which is not where most of the energy and money and infrastructure for potato research is, looking at wild potatoes has the potential to revolutionize future potato breeding and production. Relatively few studies have examined the genome evolution and diversity of wild and cultivated landrace potato. Cultivated landrace is like a kind of potato, or it's semi-cultivated. Landrace potatoes, which limits the application of their diversity in potato breeding. We're looking for genotype-phenotype connections here that can be used for agricultural purposes. So even in studies of potatoes where you would think of this looks a little closer to like good old natural sciences biology, where I'm just trying to map a genome because I want to know some stuff, at least for the purposes of the abstract, which probably means for the purposes of the funding, which may or may not mean for like things that live on the scientist's heart. We want to know about it because we want to use it for breeding, because we want to make more and better potatoes. Have you guys heard of adversarial AI? You're like training AI to get better and better at recognizing something. So there's an adversarial relationship between potatoes and potato pests. This is not potatoes. This is like everything in land crops, row crops, fruit and vegetables. Livestock's really good at trying to kill itself without anyone else around. Plants need pests to try to kill them. This is not, I mean, sorry, I'm not doing a good job of framing this thought. Let me restart. There are a number of pests that always kill yield for potatoes. The Colorado potato beetle, a disease that is just called potato early die, late blight. There's a number of nematodes that like to work their way into potato rootstock. There are storage diseases of potatoes that can infect entire like multi-ton storage facilities. And all of these diseases are exactly the thing that people are trying to breed out of potatoes. So there's always going to be like an arms race between people who are between the potatoes and the potato pests. And agricultural scientists are trying to participate in this arms race and advocate for the side of potatoes against the pests. Some of that means that there are plant pathologists out there who are studying the pests and trying to figure out what weaknesses the pests have. Others are studying and looking for the strengths that potatoes have that might make them resistant. But you can think of it in that kind of adversarial AI mode, if that helps you understand. So I'm gonna do this quickly. This is a short series of potato field day demonstrations that my research team and I got to witness during the field day in Montcalm County, Michigan in summer of 2023. And if we're lucky, we get to watch a drone try to fertilize some potatoes. See if I can get the cursor out of the way. It's not actually running live fertilizer. We're getting a demonstration here of how people are trying to use drone technology to create more targeted fertilization and pesticide application. So this is, I mean, again, you all are in California. You've seen drones, but I think it's cool. And we see fertilizer and pesticide drones starting to incorporate, not yet to replace the big, large-scale skeletal infrastructures that run down rows. Have you guys seen these row crops? Like giant things that look like wire gates and spray water. Yeah. Drones are another option for that. So at this potato field day, we learned about the arms race this year, and it's kind of like how they come out with a new flu shot every year, and they're like, these are the strains of flus that are most likely to impact you. And so we're going to put those in your flu shot and hope that we're right and make predictions about what we need to do and what pests and what strains of disease we need to be most worried about. So this is a Colorado potato beetle here. And this year we're worried about Colorado potato beetles because they've swung up because of some environmental conditions. At that field day, I had the great good fortune to meet a composter, a guy who started his life as a dairy farmer and realized that he was going to, as he said, make more money by selling what came out of the cows than what the cows could go into. So he became a manure expert and now sells manure and custom blends manure. He has an incredibly scientific mind. He does experiments. These are just a few of the experiments on compost and manure that he showed me on a tour of his composting facility. This is a vermicompost mix. And I want you to notice here exactly the same sort of record keeping that we were talking about that started off this idea of scientific agriculture. This guy is really concerned that people don't think of him as a scientist, not because he has a problem with scientists. He loves scientists. He works with scientists. He contracts with Michigan State University to sell specific soil and compost blends that go into the experiments that we looked at on the previous slide. But he doesn't want to claim. It's like a stolen valor thing. He's like, I don't publish. I don't have credentials. I'm not a scientist. I believe there is a case to be made that this guy is doing more and more interesting science than a lot of the folks who are doing extension at the university that he is participating in. He has really innovative, cool ideas. And because he doesn't publish, he doesn't think of himself as a scientist. He actually wants to hire someone like the equivalent of an agronomy postdoc to be the scientist and like get his ideas out into the world. And I wanted to highlight this both because it's an example of the kind of scientific mindset that has created agriculture as we see it in the United States today, and also because this is not the thing that philosophers of science mean when they say citizen science, but this is citizens doing science. And I think if we're going to continue to talk about citizen science as philosophers of science, we need to think about this kind of activity as well. One of the researchers that we talked to, a commercial industry private researcher with a consulting company, named this truck bed science. And I think truck bed science has an interesting contrast to citizen science that we hope to explore in some future work, hopefully once my grad student gets a job. So we already mentioned the Lay's example. This is just that website I told you about. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go in depth on potato storage stuff, but again, this is how potatoes are stored. There's a lot of stuff that goes into architecture and storage considerations. So 6 examples quickly. This is just summarizing what we've already seen. We saw variety trials, which visualize and identify opportunities for experimental intervention at each step. These emphasize the synthetic dimension of agricultural research, which is really interesting to me. Highlights the roles of extension groups in creating agricultural research and sustaining agricultural research. The gene mapping distinguishes wild from cultivated potatoes, which is maybe a little bit of a question in itself, maybe even a question that Carolyn had at the beginning of the talk before we had the talk of like, are there different species of potatoes? Do they make multiple species? Well, we have wild and cultivated potatoes, and who knows? Potatoes breed by cutting them up and putting them in the ground. So you're not doing like sexual reproduction. So you can't define species in that way. I don't actually know the answer to the question of like, are there different species of potatoes? We have to think about that. But the important thing here is that the phenotypes we're looking for, the rationale for doing this research in the first place is to incorporate it into potato breeding. Field day demonstration showed application-driven research. I'm not going to talk about the other half of it because my collaborator isn't here with me today. Composting experiments show us industry research and truck bed science. The sustainability pledge looks at social economic impacts between climate science and agribusiness. Agricultural science there functions as a bridge between agribusiness and climate science. And then the storage research focuses on this weird aspect of the potato life cycle that is created specifically and essentially by potatoes' relationship to humans. We wouldn't care about storage diseases of potatoes if we weren't storing potatoes. Potatoes aren't like rolling around in the wild, breaking through the soil and like collecting themselves in caves for bears. We have potato storage problems because of us, not because of potatoes. So that especially helps us to see how potatoes as an agricultural object look a little different than if we were to think about potatoes in the kind of classic plant biology way. Potatoes are food sources, economic resources, elements of crop production, objects of lobbying, possibly vegetables, and products in need of complex engineering to produce and store. Biological potatoes are some of these things. And I actually think that what objects in the world, this is now doing a little bit of like classic philosophical metaphysics, like let's sum over the number of things in the world that are potatoes. Most of them, by biomass, have been interfaced with humans because we like growing potatoes more than we like growing weeds. And so we've cleared out some weeds and we've planted potatoes. So the thing that potatoes are, I think, are agricultural more than simply or merely biological. So I'm still trying to understand and think about, and this is where I'd love some help from other philosophers, other scientists, whether this makes sense to consider potatoes as a non-biological object, as an agricultural object instead or first or primarily, really, maybe. I want to find language, and I'm still like, this is early days for this research. This is only the second time and the first 72-hour period that I've ever presented any of this research or done it in public in any way. So I'm trying to think about how to talk about this thing of like potatoes being really agricultural, essentially or importantly agricultural. As a philosopher, I tend to be a pluralist. I like having multiple frameworks and describing interactions between those frameworks. And so it's a little weird to me in my own like self-examination that I care about saying they're really or importantly or actually agricultural. And I think it's because there's a bias, maybe not necessarily in the sciences, but in the philosophy of science, to think of like the natural biological frame as the frame that we know how to talk about, that we have talked about, that we have a dialectical history in our literature of talking about. We don't have, with a few important exceptions who are sitting in the front of the room here, people who are like talking about agricultural science in philosophy of science. So it's a little bit of like, I just want to change the conversation in philosophy. And I want to change the conversation more broadly by thinking about how we classify and understand what kind of thing a potato is. So I think that the identification of potatoes as objects of inquiry within ag-sci goes beyond ways that philosophers have figured out how to talk about classification problems in other areas of science. So we see cross-cutting from Khalidi and Hofstad. We see non-uniqueness from folks like Hacking and Dupre. If those are to be understood to require bridge type accounts of how to get from one frame to another, which some of them do, some of them don't, then I think that's actually not our best bet. I have argued elsewhere with a philosopher named Catherine Kendig that agricultural science generates endemic classification systems for its experiments. We've shown that there's a thing called grower standard that is really important to agricultural scientific experiments that doesn't show up in other like ontologies, typologies, classifications of the parts of an experiment in other sciences. And we're working together on this idea of how social values are specifying agricultural contexts. And here we mean social values like you got to eat. So what counts as yield, for instance, influences our understanding of what counts as good cropping practices, the sustainability stuff we saw earlier. So that's where I'm going immediately next with this, and I'd love to talk about that more in the Q&A. I want to point out in the future, this is also your farm that you have. It's like right over there. You know, it's like it's literally the solar field you've seen. I just want you to know what it looks like from back in the field. I promised in the title of the talk something about the aims of science, and now we're on the last slide. So I'm actually going to say something very small about the aims of science, which is that I think, like medical science, and like the science that I spent most of my early career looking at, which is nanoscience, there's something weird and different about agricultural science that makes it look in practice, in process, in its construction of new knowledge and its generation of new theories and experiments, unlike the sciences that philosophers have figured out how to study so far. And I think maybe less so for nano, but in the same way of medical science, one of the big things that we see in agricultural science is that it's what Barker and Kitcher have called meliorative. This means it is working not just to describe the world as it is, but to improve the world in a way that is convenient or desirable for humans. Medical science works on health, right? And this is a little bit of an old school way of describing medical science in some philosophical literature, but we're going to go with it. We're not just looking to understand health in medicine, we're looking to improve health, or at least perform a series of interventions to maintain health so that health doesn't get worse. And the same thing can be said for food production and agriculture. I told you there's this kind of adversarial relationship between crops and pests. And crops are the things we are trying to at least maintain, if not improve. We really want to improve them, but we want to at least not let them get worse. How many of us have let a garden plot go to seed for a year, left it alone for a year, right? And what happens when you do that? Do you have as good of lettuce or carrots next year? No, like it requires human intervention to maintain the agricultural products that we make. And so in that way, the scientific processes that we use to study the practice of agriculture, like the scientific processes that we use to study the practice of medicine, are aimed at not just describing what is, but bringing what could be into existence. And so Barker and Kitcher have called this the meliorative framework or ideal of science. And we tend to think of it as something that we see more in applied sciences. And we like to use applied, and we like to pretend that we don't think that it's a pejorative. But the real philosophers of science love to talk about real, pure science. And then there's folks like me who want to talk about applied science. So here we are. I looked at nanoscience a lot in my early career, and nanoscience has a lot of integration with engineering and synthetic sciences, material sciences, where the goal is to make new stuff in the world. And if you have really nice carbon fiber bikes, you have stuff that has been made with a product of nanotechnology. If you have a washing machine, or have seen a washing machine that has silver nanoparticles, or if you have socks that say they have antibacterial silver, you have nanotechnology, you're working with it, you're using it right now. And nanotechnology doesn't necessarily frame itself in the same meliorative way, and engineering doesn't necessarily frame itself in the same meliorative way, but like, we're not making new things to make our lives worse. And we're not making new things just to make new things. Most of the time, we are at least justifying fucking around with engineering because we're saying we want to make things better. And so I actually think engineering sciences, synthetic sciences fall into this meliorative category. And I think that medical science and agricultural science and engineering all work in this meliorative way, in part because they're all trying to make things. Not just new things, not just different things, but things that improve on the things that we already have. Again, that's been how we've gotten to farming. That's how we got a cow that looks like that. It's not a wild thing. That is an engineered, breeded, domesticated object. Another way farther in the future direction that you can ask me about if you want to is the relevance of philosophical work on multi-scale modeling, especially as an alternative to stories about reduction and emergence, and multi-scale ecological approaches to scientific problem solving. I think that'll be an important and interesting part of this story to tell in the future. But for now, I want to thank my research team. Ryan McCoy, my graduate student and research assistant, has been an essential part of this project. He's incredible. Catherine Kendig has also been incredible. She was my host in Michigan. She's been my co-author. We were lucky enough to co-opt a couple extra graduate students, Gregory Rogel from Michigan State and Joshua Tonkel from Notre Dame, into coming and doing a few ride-alongs with us and helping us gather some data. So that's all of us down in the corner there, arranged by height accidentally. I want to thank you all for hosting me and our interviewees, including Emily Pfeiffer, who is squatting here in the back. She's a plant pathologist at the University of Kentucky, and her kindness in letting me ask her a bunch of weird philosophy questions has really gotten this project off the ground back in 2017, 2018. Thank the National Science Foundation for my own funding and my research group for helping me. And I will thank all of you for listening.